Good morning. I'm Sana, and you're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. This month, I am pleased to present special programming for you. I'm so excited to present a few featured episodes from Black is America, an award-winning podcast highlighting little-known African-American figures and other stories. Joining me each Monday this month is the creator of the show and Memphis's own Dominic Lawson. Before launching Black is America, Dominic was the creator and host of the Startup Life podcast, which provided listeners with the edge they need in building their businesses and climbing the corporate ladder. The Startup Life featured interviews with an array of entrepreneurs and business owners and was syndicated nationally and internationally. Currently, Dominic is the podcast producer, editor, and host for Meadows Behavioral Healthcare. He hosts the long-running series Beyond Theory podcast that brings in-depth conversations with first-hand insights from the people on the front lines of mental health and addiction recovery. He is also the host of the award-winning podcast Recovery Replay, which journals personal stories of recovery. Welcome, Dominic.
Thank you so much for having me again this week. It really is an honor.
Yes, well, I am so excited. I mean, how could I not have you on the show? I'm just so glad that we are able to collaborate in this way because, again, I can't say enough good things about Black is America. The episodes are phenomenal, and I'm so glad that here we are also in a season 2 of Black is America. So very exciting.
Absolutely. It's been a long journey. You was reading the bio, and I'm always just kind of like, who is she talking about? She can't be talking about me. But no, it's Black is American, and we've talked about this. It's very important to get these messages and stories out there. And so to be here again for season 2, because thankfully it didn't get canceled for season 1, so that's great. Because my wife is the executive producer, so she has the power to say yay or nay. So she said yay for season 2.
All
so
right.
I better keep winning these awards. So
is that what it is? Yes, we need the contract renewed.
Yeah, get that contract renewed. But no, she, like myself, think these stories are very important. So I'm very honored that you would have us to present some of these conversations and these stories to your audience and to your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Such important stories. I know last week we were able to listen to the phenomenal story of Tom Lee, who Memphis's Tom Lee Park is named after. So a name that is familiar to a lot of Memphians. But now folks have a greater understanding of exactly who Tom Lee was. So if you missed that episode, you definitely have to go back and listen to it. But what I really loved was that focus on courage. That's what stood out to me, that everyday courage that Tom Lee had, the courage that we all could tap into. And that's
Absolutely
what I found really inspiring about his story.
And I think that's the beauty of, that's why we named it, the everyday hero. You know what I mean? Because I think all of us have this thing in us to see, somebody, being wrong, somebody in dire need of help.
Mhm.
And we all have that need to where something in our brain, something in our heart, probably even as well,
Mhm.
just kind of takes over. It's like, you know what, that person is in need of help. And so with that story of Tom Lee, we really wanted to highlight that. They're like, hey, like, you can be anywhere at any time, and somebody's going to be in need of your help. And so you can be that person to come to their rescue, to their aid, and be that person, be that champion for that person.
Yeah, I mean, Tom Lee accomplished just a major physical feat, which is also linked to this week's featured episode as well. I don't want to jump into it or give away too much just yet. I want to actually start here. Dominic, do you like to roller skate?
I do. Grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. Grew up particularly in the Westwood area. So if you're from the
Okay.
Westwood area in the 80s and 90s, then you're very familiar with Crystal Palace.
All
Uh,
right.
and, and so we used to often go to Crystal Palace on Thursday night, because I believe Thursday night was like church gospel night or something like that, right? And so they would play all the nice gospel music and stuff like that. But on Saturdays, it got a little crunk, got a little ratchet, if you will. And so they switched up the tune a little bit. So Saturdays was on and popping too. But Crystal Palace definitely had some fond memories there as well. But also, just kind of on the other end of the city, East End Skating Ring was also
hmm
a place I used to go to often. But yeah, definitely had some times and some moments at Crystal Palace, no doubt.
Okay, okay. So I learned something new about you. So, like, how good of a roller skater are you? Like, are you the type of person who's like can do all the dancing? Are you like synchronized roller skating? Like, what's the level of skill here?
Now I would never be mistaken for an extra on roll bounce or
Okay.
anything like that. So let's just knock that out the park. But I know how not to fall, and I was a very proficient skater, right?
Okay.
I can skate, turn, go backwards a little bit, not a whole lot,
Okay.
but I was never like my Uncle Tony. My Uncle Tony, Jesus, is a Crystal Palace legend. He was that type who could be mistaken for a roll bounce extra and like,
Okay.
the skate and stuff like that and doing the thing with the weaving in between people and stuff like that. Yeah, he was pretty good. Him and his crew, they were really good.
Oh,
They were
yeah.
really good.
Okay. All right. I just had to get a sense of it because today we're talking about Ledger Smith, who did something pretty phenomenal on skates. And so I had to ask, and I'll just go ahead and put it out there. I can stand up on some skates, and that's about as far as we're gonna get. So I'll just go ahead and say that. Okay, people. No.
That's better than a lot of other people. Some people can't even do that. So that kudos to you on that one.
I'm getting anxiety just thinking about it. But for today, you have this great story about Ledger Smith. So can you give us just a little snippet or a little insight into what our listeners are in for today?
When I first heard of the story of Ledger Smith, the first thing that came to mind was like, this can't be real. Like, this
Hmm.
cannot be real. Like, nobody has done that. But the story of Ledger Smith is just somebody who, had a passion for civil rights in the
Hmm.
60s. And definitely, this is a time where not many people know that, like, when it came to civil rights and integrating like buses and lunch counters and stuff like
Hmm.
that, one of the biggest impacts or one of the biggest things that we wanted to have desegregated was places of leisure. This is like your roller rinks or your amusement parks, swimming pools, if you will. We
Hmm.
kind of talked about that in the Tom Lee episode, and so him doing with his feet on roller skates as it relates to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, wanted to highlight that part. And so
Hmm.
when I heard that story, I was like, I can do something really unique with
Yeah.
this story, right? And so I wanted to take on that challenge, and I think we created something really special and really wonderful. And just kind of highlighted a little bit. Even some of the family members of Ledger Smith reached out and said they loved the storytelling uh, uh, uh,
Ah.
of of how we did it, and so it was really fascinating to hear that story, but to kind of put some Blackest America seasoning on it was
Oh,
really
yeah.
awesome to kind of do. It was awesome to do.
Yes, like you, when I heard the story, of course, when I heard this episode, I was like, no way. You're telling me that this man roller skated all the way to Washington, D.C. I have to know more. And I
Right.
was just really captivated by his story. But also, I think I love that reminder that the civil rights movement was about everyday life, right? We think about kind of these big, kind of what folks were fighting for around these big ideas of justice, these big ideas of equality. But it was also about that everyday experience of being a person in this world and being to move about and enjoy, your everyday life.
Right. You bring up a important thing, Sanaa, because I think a lot of times when we hear certain movements, even today, we always, sometimes at least I always have the question is, what is it that we want?
Hmm.
Right. And I think from in the 50s and 60s, not just with Martin Luther King, but also with A. Philip Randolph
Hmm.
and others, they really I can't think of the organizer's name. I'm having a brain fart, but when we think about some of the organizers and highlighting exactly to President Kennedy, this is what we need. This is what we are asking for, right? And those little minute details. I think it's important that when you have a movement, when you have a situation of fighting for justice, those little small minute parts, they
Hmm.
matter.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's, sometimes get lost often when we have these grand ideas, we want justice. Well, how do you define justice, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the important things I definitely wanted to highlight in this episode.
And I think you did it so well from, again, bringing in that focus on leisure, right? Desegregation of leisure spaces, whether it's roller skating rinks or amusement parks or swimming pools, but also linking it to these bigger ideas of what we kind of typically think about when we think of the 1960s civil rights movement. And particularly in this case here, Ledger Smith is rolling on towards DC for the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. And again, just masterful storytelling. Thank you so much for
Thank you
this.
so much for saying that.
I mean, it is. It's so true. It's so good. And I don't want to give too much away, but I love the incorporation of, different voices and really focusing on what this March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was about, because I think again, from this current standpoint where we are today, people are familiar with this language of March on Washington. And again, they kind of think like, oh, people are just marching on Washington to fight for their rights, but without that understanding of there was a detailed list of demands that people wanted. And it very much was focused on some of these economic aspects, right? The ability to get a job, the ability to have training for jobs, the ability to not have discrimination in employment, but also, again, that focus on desegregating public accommodations as well.
Absolutely. And I wanted to highlight, you brought up some of the voices. I wanted to highlight, at a granular level, at a micro level, some of the stories that are
Mm-hmm.
brought up in the episode to show how those people were affected at that micro level.
Yeah.
It's one thing to have these grand ideas of what justice is. It's even another idea to have those minute details like we talked about earlier. But when
Mm-hmm.
you have that story that highlights the impact of what people are experiencing at that micro level,
Mm-hmm.
that adds a whole nother element of avocation. That has a whole nother element of advocacy,
Mm-hmm.
if you will. And so I think it's important to highlight those stories, because I can tell you stats and figures and dates and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that all the time. But if I get you to understand the story of how the impact made somebody feel, or how they were basically impacted,
Mm-hmm.
um, you really get an understanding and an idea from a very personal level of
Mm-hmm.
like, this isn't right.
Yeah.
This can't be right. And I'll just sneak a little bit in there when we talk about, because one of the things that people don't really, maybe not necessarily acknowledge, but pretty much understand the impact that media, when you see
Mm.
images and
Yeah.
video of certain things, there's just something that just bubbles up in you. Again, just going back to Tom Lee, like, this isn't right.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think for a lot of people during that time period, it was all theoretical. It was all
Mm-hmm.
just kind of like, that's happening somewhere else. That's happening, whatever. But when those images come into your home and you see those things, it's like, this isn't right. This just, something about this just feels wrong. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to do that in an audio format to highlight what was going on with some of those voices that you will hear in this episode.
Yeah, and you did it so well, again, making us feel like we were there and understand what the context of the time, understand what different people, whether from just your everyday person to someone who is in a position of power, how they were understanding these events and how they were moved by them, which I think is what you have been talking about. And that's what makes these pieces of history come alive. But also, I saw so many, of course, parallels to our present day as well. Um, and so making those connections of what is past is always present. And with that, also the understanding that as an individual, we still have a lot of opportunity to do something, just like the people that you're featuring throughout this episode, but also through Black is America overall.
And I'm glad you said that, because while and this kind of comes up, for the March on Jobs and Freedom, that like, it wasn't just about Black people. Like,
Mm-hmm.
this was not a march just for Black people to get justice, rights, whatever have you. This was for people to come later on down the line, the Asian community, the
Mm-hmm.
Hispanic community, the Jewish community, whoever. Like, wrong is just wrong. right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think people who were in the civil rights movement understood that. There's a famous story about the fight for disability in San Francisco and how the Black
Mm-hmm.
Panther Party came to their aid. Right, you wouldn't probably think about the disabled community and the Black Panther Party merging worlds, but that here they are, right? And so I think it just goes to show again that like wrong is just wrong. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think with the March on Jobs and Freedom really highlights that, and that they wanted to make sure that we talked about equality for all, not just in words, but in
Mm-hmm.
action and through acts of Congress.
Yes. And I think that's an important point because, again, we sometimes don't understand the entire context of some of these what are now historical events. And we do think of it as it was just fighting for African Americans. But in fact, for these different leaders and folks involved in the movement, they had a very broad vision of what equity looked like for folks across the United States, but also around the globe as well. And so I think when we understand that this was equality for all, but also a change in the systems that led to that inequality, we can get a broader vision for ourselves as well, and what that might look like today in a 2023.
I believe so. I definitely believe so. Again, because we're still fighting some of these same issues,
Hmm.
LGBTQA rights. We're talking about,
Hmm.
rights for disabled people still. Like there's still these issues to while the civil rights movement definitely laid the foundation
Hmm.
for many of these movements. There's still tons of work to be done. And that's through advocacy. There's through which is kind of what we do through Black Americans is a form of advocacy, if you will. Or if you're a person who is in the halls of Congress, if you're an attorney, if you will, and so it's these groups of people coming together for a common cause, and I think they definitely had it right when it came to the civil rights movement for sure.
Absolutely. And one thing that, thinking about like some of the different issues that we're still fighting for here 60 years later, from the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, what I was really moved by was Dr. King's speech at the March on Washington. And particularly because in the episode, you say, if you can hear this speech in its entirety, you should listen to it. And so I said, okay, let me go listen to the speech in its entirety. And in that, if you all have listened to it, then you know that Dr. King is also drawing those parallels to how much has and has not changed, even over, 100 years. And so now here we are 60 years later, and I'm listening to his words, particularly around police brutality, particularly around voting rights. And I'm like, yes, here we are 60 years later, and some of these exact same issues, we are still fighting for freedom. We are still fighting for equality and equity at this present day. So I'm going to include a link to the audio of that speech in the show notes so that folks can listen for themselves as well.
I appreciate that. And when you mentioned about Dr. King, I think a lot of times people, let me be clear. The I Have a Dream speech, fantastic speech, wonderful speech, right?
Mhm.
It's one of the easily top three speeches of all time ever given, right? But when you go and listen to some of King's speeches and talks and interviews from like 65 to 68,
Mhm.
they're a different tone,
Oh, yeah.
right? They're a completely different tone, right? And they speak to that economic empowerment and
Mhm.
the famous line from one of his speeches: "When we come to Washington, we come to get our check," right?
Mhm.
And so I think again, it definitely just speaks to what you were saying earlier that like some of these things that he was speaking later on in his life, we're still talking about and still fighting for to this day. And it honestly just goes to show just how uh, prescient Dr.
Mhm.
King was at such an early age. I think we forget
Oh,
that he
yeah.
was 39 when he was assassinated. Like
Mhm.
that's not very old. But he had this profound knowledge and this profound understanding of the times and what it
Mhm.
can mean moving forward. And so, and that's why we're still to this day. Nicole Hannah Jones of the 1619 Project, still
Mhm.
going through those speeches and teaching us that like look, these words had some meaning and some power and we need to study them if we're
Mhm.
trying to get certain things done today.
Yes. And that's why I just love how you have interwoven so many pieces of folks' words from 60 years ago, right? That are so relevant still today. And a lot of people may not be familiar with with the content of some of these speeches or even who people were in this time period, thinking about folks who are still alive now, who
Mhm.
are in the civil rights movement. So I love that you have really, again, brought history to life and made those connections to our present day. This episode I just absolutely loved. And I mean, just thinking again about like roller skating, right? I will never think about roller skating in the same way.
Right. And that's one of the things. I'll give you just a little detail about, because, you go from Chicago to DC roller skating and stuff like that. And, I really tried to highlight, I had to do some math for this episode because the thing is like, if he travels from Chicago to DC in this amount of days, that means he's probably averaging about have to be averaging between 67 and 70 miles per day because that's the only
Mhm.
way that would make sense. And so that's why I had to, and that's how I was able to kind of pinpoint where he was on whatever day he was, right? And so
Okay.
and
Yeah.
and also using certain uh, uh, newspaper clippings and articles from that day
Yeah.
to chart out his journey. Like, okay, he has to be here on this day. So it was not only history being done, it was some math doing being had to be done for this episode too. But I think it really highlighted his journey in a definitely in a unique way.
Yes, and also just thank you for sharing a little bit of that process too, right? You doing your own calculations, but also thinking about, okay, where does he show up in some of these local newspapers? Where is he being
Right.
covered in maybe local media as well? So getting into the archives.
Absolutely. Oh, I mean, that's it. There's so many gems in the archives, from the National Archives to even now sometimes defunct news papers and stuff like that. Like
Mhm.
the Baltimore African American it was a huge piece um, of research for this episode. But that's the beauty of history, right? Like
Yeah.
there's so many viewpoints and angles and stuff like that, and it can really kind of shed a light from this vantage point. This is what I saw. From this vantage
Mhm.
point, this is what I saw. It kind of reminds me of the Bible and the Gospels, like John, Martin, Matthew,
Yeah.
Luke, and their perspectives of Jesus, right?
Mhm.
So that's kind of what history is for me. So I'm a history nerd. I could talk about this all day, but my point is that like history is not just these siloed stories from the past. Like they come
Mhm.
from different vantage points, different different perspectives, and they still ask some of the pertinent questions that we're asking today.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's what I love about Black is America, making all that, first making us aware of some of these great stories, and some fun stories, right? Thinking about roller skating, but also the relevancy for our times today. Now, I noticed that you mentioned that some of Ledger Smith's family reached out to you. So, might there be maybe some follow up on this story coming in season two?
There is for season two. Oh, so let me go back. So originally, one of the granddaughters of Ledger Smith reached out and say, "Hey, love the episode, love what you did." I don't think I ever heard him being referred to as Uncle Ledge because that's one of the things I do in Black is America. But I loved it. It was cute. I loved it.
Mhm.
Definitely loved the storytelling. I'm going to let the other family members know
Oh,
about it. And
wow.
so
Mhm.
recently, a few days ago, Ledger Smith's daughter reached out and said she loved
Wow.
the episode and actually wanted to highlight a few things as well,
Mhm.
because in the episode, I say that he's a semi-professional roller skater, but she's like, no, 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 he was a full-time professional
Okay,
roller
come
skater. So
on.
I was like, yay, put some respect on my man's name.
All
I'm like,
right.
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So we're definitely going to, for season two, uh, going to highlight some of those things and correct some of those things. But that's the one of the things I always said from the beginning of Black is America. If we get something wrong or we have something out of context, let us know, right?
Yeah.
So and we
Mhm.
have no shame and no problem correcting the record, because the thing is, like, these people are phenomenal human beings that we're highlighting. We want to make sure we get it right. And if that means we get it right 2-3 years down the road, then we get it right 2-3 years down the road, because there's so much stuff that we have to go through. And for some of these people, there's so little to go on,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so when you have a family member say, hey, no, let's add this to the record. Yes, let's absolutely add that to the record. And so that's something we're definitely going to do for season 2.
All right. Well, I cannot wait to hear that conversation. Dominic, thank you so much. Let's go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, you'll be listening to Black is America.
It's August 17th, 1963, in downtown Chicago. It's a pretty nice Saturday morning, as many are probably unwinding from a long and hard work week. But also on this Saturday are those that are preparing to travel. See, there is this big gathering that is happening in Washington, D.C. to advocate for civil rights. There are going to be some great speakers in attendance. A future congressman, a woman deemed the voice of the century will sing. Now, where have I heard that before? And even this Southern preacher from the state of Georgia that everybody keeps talking about. Some are taking the train to the event. Others are taking the bus, or they're packing up the car for a 23-hour ride. A select few are actually flying into DC for this historic event. But let's head over to 431 Dearborn Street. For proper context today, this address sits near Harold Washington Library Center, named after Chicago's first African-American mayor. Also, fun fact, I helped him get elected. I mean, I was a toddler stuffing envelopes, but hey, I helped. My bad, I'm getting off task again. Anyways, now 431 Dearborn Street is home to a branch office of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. But as we head over, there's an interesting sight in front of the office. There's a man on roller skates. Now, remember the planes, trains, and automobiles as modes of transportation for the people I mentioned earlier? Well, this gentleman, or Ledger Rollerman Smith, is heading there on, well, roller skates. Yeah, you heard that right. Roller skates. He has a sign across his chest that says freedom, and he's raring to go. And just to be safe, officials from the NAACP are going to escort him just in case there's some trouble. And as Ledger Smith starts his 10-day journey heading down Lakeshore Drive on his way towards East Chicago, Indiana, he points out to the country and to the world that there are many paths to freedom. We come from innovators, heroes, and royalty. We are our ancestors' greatest hope. We face many challenges, but we mold that adversity into our greatest strength. We are the glue that holds a nation together and allows it to flourish. Welcome to Black is America, the podcast that highlights little-known African-American figures and stories that make our history come to life. I'm your host, Dominic Lawson. Episode 7, Ledger Smith, Rolling Towards Freedom. This month will mark the 59th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And I knew I wanted to make some type of content surrounding that. But it wasn't until I started my deep dive that I came across the story of Ledger Smith. Ledger, at this time, is 27 years old with a wife and 3 kids. His wife is also on the way to the march, but she took the train. Now, Uncle Ledge was not some novice on the wheels. He was a semi-pro performer out of Los Angeles, performing jumps over chairs, doing cartwheels, and even a fire hoop act, all on roller skates. But even with all that in the repertoire, it still doesn't compare to an almost 700-mile trek from Chicago to DC. But he has trained greatly for this journey. See, 2 weeks leading up, he ran 5 miles a day to prepare himself for the rigors his body would have to endure. It's no accident that he's traveling there on skates. He has a message. When asked, he said he wanted to, quote, dramatize the march by picking the slowest way, end quote. And boy, he wasn't kidding. But there is another message. But before we get into it, let's leave Uncle Ledge to focus on the road. He's going to need it. We will check back in with him later. Now, if you know Black culture, then you are probably aware of the impact it has made on the hobby of roller skating. This is highlighted in the 2019 Vice documentary found on HBO, United Skates.
As you go across the country, you'll find it's a really thriving rink. It's because they have a really strong African-American skate community.
It was a place where the streets, everybody met up.
But that wasn't always the case. And to highlight this, let's go back a ways. It's going to take us a while to get there. Hey, while we get there, don't you just love history? Going back in time, learning stuff. It's kind of cool, huh? Okay, right about here. The roller skate was created in 1863, and roller rinks were created a year later. But roller skating was mostly something the rich did for entertainment. It would gain more popularity at the end of the 1800s as more roller rinks were mass-produced during the rapid economic growth of the Gilded Age, and it would reach a peak from the end of World War I to the beginning of the Great Depression. But its popularity would pick up again in the 50s and 60s. But roller rinks, just like swimming pools, museums, and amusement parks, were segregated. And Black and Hispanic people were not allowed to come in. In Victoria W. Walcott's book, Race, Riots, and Roller Coasters, the call to desegregate these places of leisure was crucial to the civil rights movement. And that call came straight from the top. Remember that Southern preacher from Georgia I mentioned at the top of the show? Well, months earlier, before the March on Washington, while sitting in a Birmingham jail, he penned a letter and he talks about the need to desegregate places of leisure. And here, thanks to the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University, is Dr. King reading an excerpt from his famous letter from a Birmingham jail.
When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait.
And many organizations shared the sentiment of Dr. King. The NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and maybe even one of the unlikeliest of allies of civil rights, the U.S. Communist Party. Yes, that same Communist Party. They actually led a campaign to integrate a roller rink in 1938 in Brooklyn, New York. The owners of the Mecca Roller Skating Palace wouldn't sell tickets to Black members of the CPUSA. They put up quite a fight to integrating their roller rink, but they eventually backed down when they were threatened with court action. The CPUSA would celebrate this victory with a big integrated skate party at the very same roller rink. So as you can see, that was the other message Uncle Ledge shared as he headed to Washington, D.C. on roller skates. Speaking of Uncle Ledge, let's check back in with him. It's day 3 of his trip on August 19th, 1963. From Chicago, he's traveled through East Chicago, Indiana, Hammond, and Gary, Indiana, en route to... Wait, hold on for a second. Y'all hear that? Whoa. King. Not yet, King. Hold on for a second. We're not there yet. Thank you. Whew. Pop stars, am I right? Okay, where was I? Like I was saying, He's gone through Michigan City, South Bend, Indiana, Elkhart, and is now on U.S. Highway 30 just outside of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Uncle Ledge is still riding with his freedom sash, and he is greeted pleasantly by both black and white people as he passes. They say things like "God bless you" and "See you in D.C." But of course, there was the occasional heckler of people who felt some type of way about the March on Washington. You know what? Hold up for a sec, because there's a car coming up on him pretty fast. Watch out, Uncle Ledge! Man, that is crazy. A car just pulled up and tried to hit Ledger Smith. Wow, people really don't want him to make it to D.C. Luckily, they miss him. However, I shouldn't be surprised by this action. See, according to a Gallup poll, 57% of Americans said that civil disobedient activities, such as sit-ins and mass demonstrations, hurts the chances of integration. Even a year later, after the March on Washington, a whopping 74% of people thought that mass demonstrations were detrimental to achieving racial equality. The NAACP officials who are traveling with Uncle Ledge, I imagine, check him out to make sure he is okay. And it appears that Uncle Ledge is unbothered and continues into Ohio, getting ever closer to D.C. And while he is doing that, and speaking of that very march, let's discuss how it came to be in the first place. We'll check back with Uncle Ledge later. Let's go to 1941. See, many black soldiers were left out of World War II defense jobs and programs created by President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal after the Great Depression. One of the leaders of the civil rights movement at the time, A. Philip Randolph, plans a march on Washington to protest these matters. However, the march is canceled the day before when Randolph meets with President Roosevelt, as he has agreed to enact an executive order forbidding discrimination against those in government and the defense industry. He establishes the Fair Employment Practice Committee, or FEPC, to enforce these matters. However, with the passing of President Roosevelt in 1945, the FEPC is dissolved when Congress halted the funding for the commission the next year in 1946. Now, during the 50s, Randolph would call for a march on Washington to capitalize on Dr. King's rise to national prominence, but it doesn't come to pass. I mean, there was a gathering in 1957 to celebrate the 3rd anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education ruling in an effort to urge the federal government to enforce the decision, but that's about it. But as violent attacks towards civil rights demonstrators continued, including during a children's march in Birmingham, Alabama, where TV cameras and newspapers captured protesters as old as 18 and as young as 7, with fire hoses being used on them, that would change things greatly.
During 1963, we heard of a man coming to town. His name was Martin Luther King, Jr., and he would be speaking at 16th Street Baptist Church, and we could join him there.
This is Mamie Chalmers, a civil rights activist. She was one of those young people there at Kelly Ingram Park.
We were in Kelly Ingram Park. Every day we would meet right in that park, and we was there getting ready, getting our assignments. Where was we going to march from that day? Bull Connor, he called out the Birmingham Fire Department, told them, turn the water hose on them and they won't have to take a bath. He ordered that. That was an order, direct order from him, and that's what they did. And today I'm deaf in one ear because of that. Dr. King explained to us that this is a nonviolent march. You might get kicked, you might get spit on, but tell the person that's doing, I still love you just the same.
One of the great tools used in the civil rights movement, besides nonviolent protest, was media. Videos and images of this march was not only thrust into the homes of American families, but in media around the world, including one of the biggest of them all, the British Broadcasting Company, or the BBC. Remember, this is 1963, during the height of the Cold War with Russia. so Russian newspapers would take American exceptionalism to task. To give you an idea of how horrific this scene is, at the time of the march, attorney David Vann is on the phone with American businessman A.G. Gaston. I have to warn you, what Gaston describes is chilling, to say the least.
And he was expressing a great deal of resentment about King coming in and messing up the thing when we were getting a new start. And then he said to me, he said, but Lawyer Vann said, they've turned fire hoses on a little black girl. They're rolling that little girl right in the middle of the street now. I can't talk to you no more.
It was there to stand up on my building looking down on Bull Con and them shooting water in the park right across from my office there in that park. I guess that's the most outstanding thing in my mind right now. I just couldn't imagine what could happen.
I can imagine the American people were starting to understand what was going on in the American South to Black people. And the sentiment my wife shares all the time, especially those who are probably on the fence about civil rights, is this: once you see it, you can't unsee it. And from there, the movement towards a march on Washington was in motion. Now, President Kennedy was not exactly thrilled at the idea of the march. He said it was, quote, ill-timed, end quote. He might have had a point. See, his civil rights bill had stalled in Congress. Now, he would ultimately, but reluctantly, endorse the march, but he sent his attorney general and younger brother, Robert Kennedy, to organize with Bayard Rustin, chief organizer of the event. Quick side note, if you ever want a great case study on the logistics of how to pull off a historic event like the March on Washington, study how Uncle Bayard pulled this off. It's a logistical masterpiece, if you ask me. The demonstration would be limited to the Lincoln Memorial. The original plan was to first go to the Lincoln Memorial and then to the Capitol to urge the passing of the Civil Rights Act. President Kennedy didn't want the protest to make it to the Capitol for fear of, and I'm not making this up, having Congress feel as if it was under siege. Wow, history is such a powerful teaching tool. Because speaking of sieges and the Capitol, 56 years later tells us that civil rights activists should have been the least of their worries. But I digress. But as we look over the Potomac River, I think I see our guy. He's done it. His 10-day trip that started off in downtown Chicago and saw him go through Ohio into Pennsylvania, through the cities of Pittsburgh, Uniontown, Cumberland, Hagerstown, Maryland, and Frederick, and finally into D.C. He can hear the singing of the sea of 250,000 people there for a common cause. Someone else is there also.
Well, on that hot day in August 63, I was eager. As they say, I was all fired up.
Remember Mamie Chalmers from the Children's March? While she did sustain injuries in Alabama, it appears her conviction never wavered.
And ready to participate again, do anything that I could. One of the things that inspired me was when Dr. King said, "I have a dream." And that was one of the things that really inspired me to march.
Now, I'm sure Uncle Edge is tired, achy, and probably a bit hungry. Hey, Uncle Edge, make sure you grab one of those lunches the New York Labor Union sent. As a matter of fact, get 2 of them. You deserve it, my man. Hey, it looks like someone's about to speak. Who's that young fellow up there?
We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. Hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here.
If you remember, I mentioned a future congressman at the top of the show who would speak at the march. The voice you hear is a 23-year-old John Lewis, who at the time was the national chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And you could tell early on that Uncle John absolutely had no problem speaking truth to power.
My friends, Let us not forget that we are involved in a serious social revolution. By and large, American politics is dominated by politicians who build their career on immoral compromise and allow themselves an open form of political, economic, and social exploitation. There are exceptions, of course. We salute those. But what political leader can stand up and say, my party is the party of principles? For the party of Kennedy is also the party of Islam. The party of Jarvis is also the party of Goldwater. Where is our party? Where is the political party that will make it unnecessary to march on Washington? Where is the political party that will make it unnecessary to march in the streets of Birmingham? Where is the political party that will protect the citizens of Albany, Georgia? Do you know that in Albany, Georgia, 9 of our leaders have been indicted, not by the Dixiecrats, but by the federal government for peaceful protest? But what did the federal government do when Albany Deputy Sheriff beat Attorney C.B. King and left him half dead? What did the federal government do when local police officials kicked and assaulted the pregnant wife of Slater King and she lost her baby? Those who have said be patient and wait, we must say that we cannot be patient. We do not want our freedom gradually, but we want to be free now. We are tired. We are tired of being beaten by policemen. We're tired of seeing our people locked up in jail over and over again. And then you holler, be patient. How long can we be patient? We want our freedom and we want it now.
If you ever have the privilege of watching this speech, you can see Bayard Rustin still orchestrating and making sure that the March on Washington goes as smooth as possible. And as we pan back to Uncle Edge, oh wow, it looks like he's about to be interviewed. Let's see what he has to say.
Malcolm Davis standing by on stage with another interview with a noted personality. Please come in, Malcolm Davis.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do have an extremely interesting guest standing with us here now who has just been talking to all of the people here. Sir, would you tell us your name?
Ledger Smith.
Now, sir, would you tell us how you came to Washington and from where you came and by what means of transportation?
Okay, I left Chicago on the 17th of August on roller skates. I arrived in Washington, D.C. on the 27th at 1:45.
Tell me, sir, what sort of problems did you have? Did you have to take along spare wheels or spare skates?
Well, I do have 3 sets of wheels that I carried with me, which I didn't need. I didn't need any spare wheels at all. And my skates held up pretty good.
What sort of problems did you meet in this journey?
Well, there was times when people would cut out at me with a car. Say a place in Indiana, guy tried to run me down, but he missed.
Good, I'm glad to hear that. Tell me, were you allowed on the main parkways, or did you have to travel by side streets all the way?
No, I was more or less on the main streets, but not the toll roads. There was the old highways that each city used.
Now, of course, a journey like this on roller skates takes an enormous amount of strength and dexterity, and you have to travel with luggage. What did you do about that?
Well, I had been working out for, I say, over a week, running 5 miles every day.
And how long had you been doing this running and training for this particular
Well, I did
trip?
this running training for at least 2 weeks.
Now that you are here, sir, would you mind telling us, are you going to actually participate in the march or not?
Well, I hope to march in the march if I can find my delegation. Since I've been up here, I can't find them, so I don't know yet what's going to happen.
What's the chances that you won't actually walk in the march but skate?
Right, well, I don't think I'll be able to skate in the march. I don't think.
Can you tell me, sir, if you have any particular plans that you intend to follow through while you are actually here?
While I'm here, I like to find my wife because she come up and I haven't found her yet.
She didn't come on skates?
No, she didn't. She came by the train.
Are you going to skate back?
No, I don't want to see the skates for a month now.
I don't blame you, Uncle Edge. You go rest those skates and find your wife. And as Ledger Smith joins his wife and the over 250,000 there in attendance, they present to America and the world a united front against inequality and injustice. And just like America, this crowd is very diverse. From the labor unions I mentioned earlier that brought lunches in addition to nurses and doctors to the march, to the clergymen from all walks of faith. It makes sense when you think about it. That is because, while Black America may be the face of this march, its goal was equality for all, not just Black people, the disabled, women, the LGBTQA+, and every other marginalized community. The march was a success, not only because it went off without a major incident, but freedom would begin to ring in the halls of Congress. The Civil Rights Act would pass in 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act in 1965. On the Great Seal of the United States is the Latin phrase e pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. It's in reference to the emergence of a single nation out of the union of the 13 original colonies. For Ledger Smith, he understood the importance of this phrase, and while he took a very unique and dangerous route to the March on Washington, he knew that traveling to D.C. on skates would highlight the complexities and the importance of the need for equality for all. This country was built on protest, and it would be that same vehicle needed to make it live up to the ideals we have placed upon it. And on August 28, 1963, as Ledger Rollerman Smith made his way to the Lincoln Memorial, he was able to lend his voice to become that powerful force to make a difference. It's funny how history works, because whether it's a summer day in 1963 DC or a cold Chicago night in 2008, it's pretty amazing what you can accomplish when people get together for a common cause. Ladies and gentlemen, we leave you with the President of the United States.
It's been a long time coming, but tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
The Black is America podcast, a presentation of Owl's Education, was created and is written, researched, and produced by me, Dominic Lawson. Executive producer, Kendall Lawson. Cover art was created by Alexandria Eddings of Art Life Connections. Sources to create this episode come from the National Civil Rights Museum, History.com, the New York Times, the Baltimore African American, WAMU National Public Radio in DC, and others. For a complete list of sources, go to this episode's show notes in your podcast player or our website, www.blackisamericapodcast.com. Scenes from United States are courtesy of Vice, HBO Documentary Films, a Warner Brothers Discovery company. Be sure to like, review, and subscribe to the Black is America podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Also, let people know about the podcast. We would greatly appreciate that very much. For a full transcript of this episode and other resources, go to www.blackisamericapodcast.com. There, you can read our blog, leave us a review, or you can leave a voicemail message where you can ask a question or let us know what you think about the show that we may play in an episode. You can also hit the donation button if you like what you heard, which helps us to create more educational content like this. Finally, thank you so much for listening to the Black is America podcast, where our history comes to life. Until next time.